Welcome, folks, to this wonderful presentation, to this webinar. We have people from over 29 countries represented, and very, very excited about the panelists. Great presentations. They've obviously taken some time to pull this together in the middle of a pandemic. So I want to thank a special welcome and thank them personally for their hard work and ready to share their information. This is a continuing series of webinars that IASAS has been in partnership with ACPA and the Commission for Global Development. And that whole process has been very exciting for us to we're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, that we get a chance to talk to each other, get to share our information, and maybe make some new friends as well and colleagues. So I think that that'll be a wonderful experience and a wonderful time for us all. The webinar series, one of the first ones we did during COVID, was right at the beginning of COVID, like in March of 2020, which was exciting because now we've kind of bookended it. And that's a very exciting piece now that our interconnectedness has brought us together, gives us an opportunity, not just during these sessions, but after these sessions to also connect with each other and connect with people around the world to share our good stories and to also get some support in our work and our great profession. We have a number of panelists today. The format will be, the panelists will introduce themselves for each section. They have about 10 minutes to do their presentation, and then hopefully there'll be some time at the end for questions. And I look forward to this. This is going to be a very exciting time. So thank you all. And thank you all for being a part of this as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very honored to be part of this wonderful panel today. My name is Dania Oster. I'm head of the Cultural Department and EU Affairs at the DSW, Deutsches Studentenwerk, which is the umbrella organization of student service organizations all over Germany. And in total, we have 57 local student service organizations in which we are in charge of. Instead, meal-to-go schemes were implemented and food was delivered to students who work in quarantine in the student residence halls. And a lot of employees were in short-time employment. Now, in a post-corona perspective, the dining halls are gradually returning to full operation, especially at universities that are returning to face-to-face teaching. However, the capacity utilization of the refectories is currently only about 50 to 70%. And the reason is that they still have to comply with a very rigid hygienic rules. And we expect this area, so the area of food services and dining halls, to be the greatest, the area with the greatest long-term corona effects. So they will suffer the most from corona because we don't assume that they will ever return to 100% utilization rate. So the next, the next slide, the next, please go back. Thank you. The next area are our residence halls. In total, we have 169,000 student apartments all over Germany. And in contrast to other countries, they remained open during the pandemic. And at the beginning of the pandemic, occupancy rates in the dormitories declined due to the fact that the domestic students moved back to their parents' home because of the digital learning, and a lot of international students dropped out. However, already before COVID, we had very long waiting lists. So during COVID, there was a fast reoccupancy of the student residence halls, not by international students, but for all the German students that were on the waiting lists. And during Corona, we also implemented a lot of programs in the residence halls, for example, against loneliness or the isolation of the students. That was a main problem that we were facing in the student residence halls. And now, in the post-Corona perspective, And with the enhanced return to face-to-face classes, there is again a high demand for affordable student housing. And at many locations, what we observe now is that we even have a competitive situation because several cohorts are clashing. Those who stayed at home are going now back to the university cities, and those who have just received the university entrance qualifications. So there are a lot of young people now all looking for affordable housing, and therefore, at the moment we are facing a shortage of student housing. Concerning financial aid, there was, during the Corona crisis, we implemented an additional interim financial aid by the government. And it was a financial aid for those students in a pandemic-related emergency situation. For example, for those who lost their student jobs. And more than 100,000 students were supported by this interim financial aid. And nowadays, end of September, this federal program ended because the student market is now recovering. So next slide, please. We are also responsible for the social and psychological counseling at about 43 student service organizations. And there we observe a very high demand on counseling services during Corona, particularly amongst the international students. So there was an increase about 30% of counseling needs in some university cities, and we extended the online counseling services. But also now, in the post-Corona perspective, there's still a high demand. So at the moment, there is a mix of online and face-to-face counseling that will continue. And here we can see that Corona is not over because the demand is still very, very high. Coming to cultural services, as you all know, during Corona and during the lockdown, live events were not allowed, and many hybrid or digital formats were developed during the peak of the Corona pandemic, and some of them are so successful that they will also continue after Corona. So also after Corona, we will have a mixture between digital formats and live formats. But what we can see is that there is also a high demand by the students to go back to normal life and to have also more cultural events face-to-face. Yeah, then very short, we are also responsible for childcare. So students with children are taken care of by us, and also professors at universities. Their children can come to the childcare centers too. And they were all closed during Corona. Only for emergency care was opened. And now they are reopening, and amongst childcare workers, 60% are vaccinated. So the situation is very positive at the moment. Next slide, and that is already the last slide. Yeah, concerning the support to international students, there was, during the pandemic, there was a high dropout of short-term program students, about 45%. But the degrees seeking students, there was not such a significant drop. They were all heavily burdened by travel restrictions, isolation, job losses, etc. But the legal situation was eased by the waiver of proof of funding, for example. And now we foresee a more positive development. The situation is also improving for the international students. They are also returning, and until the end of this year, they are allowed for free testing because you might know that not all vaccinations are recognized on a European level. So we are still, as I said, in a transitional period, and therefore at our umbrella organization, we have set up a working group on the effects on the corona, and also going through all the different tasks and areas that we are covering. And maybe if we have a next seminar, we might tell you what remains and what has changed and give you a final answer. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. When I hear somebody from Deutsche Studentenwerk present, I'm always amazed at the sheer magnitude of your operation. It's incredible. It's incredible. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass it over now to Danielle.
Hi everybody, Danielle Morgan Acosta, she, her, hers. I currently serve as the ACPA president and as the Associate Dean of Students for Student Engagement and Belonging at Clark University in Massachusetts, the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc people. So great to be with you all. It's a rainy morning here to kind of talk about some of these pieces. And what you'll see on the screen is just a series of articles about what higher education, particularly in the United States, has been going through and thinking about with regards to COVID, right? I don't think we are past COVID as much as numbers are trending down for us. I think we are all anticipating what this next winter and holiday season will bring and what that will really mean for the spring. There was a lot of shifting and hope in April in the summer that then led to some other pieces, and similar to what other folks will present, we have a very disjointed way of higher education in the United States. And so things have looked different in a variety of places. For me, it's about the context that COVID has provided for everything that is really going on in terms of higher education. So you've seen articles about anti-Black racism on campus, student activism, faculty upheaval, college students and faculty and staff experiencing immense burnout, trying to better understand how are we anticipating and supporting folks, right? A free t-shirt might not be what it is that is really going to make people feel loved and cared for as we've all been kind of going through the trauma of what all of this looks like in our world. We've also seen increased mental health that was building already, but really has been exacerbated by some of this hunger and food insecurity, and this notion of people being able to more readily see on the screen how students are living, what people are really dealing with, how is that showing up spaces, as well as this fear of missing out on experiences, particularly for our sophomores this year, feeling like they lost something, even if they lived on campus last year, because they had to go through things remotely, because they didn't really get their own orientation. And for many of our institutions, acknowledging that the pandemic was the last straw, we've had many closures in the United States, and the financial implications of what COVID has done for institutions, the decrease of international students last year, the folks that might have disenrolled to then go to work. We're really seeing a lot of those different pieces show up. And when we're thinking about what is the higher education experience going to be, how are schools going to function and serve our students, but also our faculty and staff. And we're seeing a lot of concerns there across the board. I think in particularly too, what we see is how our structures have the opportunity to be shifted and changed because of what we did through COVID. And what are the things that COVID brought to the forefront in ways that are impossible for us to turn away from in many different ways. So Lisa, if you go to the next slide. And I really just have a few pieces to kind of think through that I've been looking at and seeing with my colleagues, right? So again, the varied approach, as I think was mentioned previously and is true in a couple places, COVID has been a highly politicized component of our world recently. And so our varied approaches and how institutions are explaining or understanding or living with COVID look different regionally, by state, by institution type, as well as by resources. The federal government was not providing a lot of resources directly to institutions for some of the things that they were implementing for COVID in the beginning. Some of that has shifted with a new administration. So for example, my institution of only 2,500 undergraduate students has done 200,000 COVID tests in the past year and a half. FEMA was not covering and supporting a lot of the financial implications of those until more recently for this fall semester, right? So those woes where people were deciding to take resources out. I am in a fairly progressive state where mask wearing is mostly universal, where vaccines are highly utilized. Our student population on campus is 97% vaccinated. That is not true in other parts of the country based on region or state or kind of laws and policies. If vaccinations are even seen as useful or productive, as mask wearing is happening. Most folks are back in person for classes. There are still some hybrid classes. Most activities and events are in person. And if you've seen a lot of our large institutions with football games and kind of athletic events, we are back to full force in many of those spaces, sometimes mask wearing, sometimes not. So it really, each kind of pocket of how higher education is experiencing COVID, I think, is shaping how we are really engaging, which is why I wanted to focus really on these exacerbated concerns. The racism and injustice on campus that we saw in the US really come forward, perhaps more for some folks than for others, but we've also seen this in terms of employment. There's been a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs being posted and being created on campuses, right? Like, how are we really shifting? Are we structurally making changes? Are institutions being forced to examine racial disparities that have existed since the dawn of time for our institutions? But what are we creating and really putting together? Student and staff mental health. Our numbers are showing that folks are doing a lot of soul searching, right? There's just a lot. We are all living in a bunch of trauma, and that is showing up in the classroom. It's showing up when we go to work. It's showing up in our shortness and trying to understand and engage with each other. And we're seeing that in terms of what resources are we providing? How are we better centering the wellness of our students and our faculty and staff in some meaningful ways? And how are we making sure that we're investing in those things? Food insecurity has been a concern on our college campuses. Again, with a lot of the shifts in the pain that COVID has caused, we're seeing that increase. Nationally, there is some federal movement on what they think institutions should be doing, so it'll be interesting to see what that's doing. But the food pantries and the additional financial support and trying to create things, and really asking institutions to think about enrollment and institutional stability while also thinking about how to take care of their faculty, their staff, and their students in a trauma-informed approach. And so whether there is vaccine requirements or testing requirements, events and programs, and who gets to engage and how do we get to engage, I think we are still working through what all that's going to mean and how that's going to shape us, particularly for the next semester. I think that folks are burnt out also about managing COVID and want to move on from that space. And I think that we need to hold on to make sure that we're actually in a place where we can do that, right? And really think about how are we supporting the physical and mental health of our communities regardless, because there will be other diseases, there will be other things that we really need to kind of think about in terms of infrastructure and redefining what we believe or should be thinking that normal is. And so how does that end up shaping the work that we're providing, the ways that we're engaging students, and really resetting and re-supporting our services in ways that support our current generation. The last thing I'll leave is that we just are really noticing the generational shifts of our students. And I think COVID also brought that to the forefront as well. And so we are in a critical moment where we have a lot of opportunity to make some big changes that will stabilize us. But with everything that's going on, I think our institutions are struggling with where to put those resources and how to really double down on the services that they need to provide, the financial implications, and then supporting their staff and their students and their faculty along the way.
Thank you so much. That was awesome and great timing too, by the way. Danielle, it was really interesting because what you've highlighted for all of us is that COVID didn't stop all the other issues on our campuses. And, you know, the intersectionality of that has caused quite a burden. And I think we've got to remember that when we're talking about our students and talking about our faculty and staff. That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to Amy.
Kia ora koutou. morning from very early morning from down here in New Zealand. My name's Amy Heise. I'm the Vice President Aotearoa in New Zealand for ANZSSA, the Australian and New Zealand Student Services Association. I'm also the Executive Director for Student Experience at Massey University in New Zealand. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the New Zealand experience and a little bit more about the Australian experience as well. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. I thought I'd set just a little bit of context here because New Zealand's taken a particular pathway that may or may not be similar to other parts of the world. So New Zealand and Australia both took an elimination strategy when COVID emerged. We also have obviously a different kind of timing around our semesters. So when COVID reached New Zealand in February of 2020, border restrictions became a really a significant piece of the armour that was applied to our elimination strategy, which meant that we basically closed the border to New Zealand in March, which, Lisa, if you just click to the next slide, happened to be the beginning of our first semester, basically. So we had restrictions placed on students coming to New Zealand, and the arrival of our first semester was relatively heavily impacted by the implementation of an alert system, which required us to have quite a weighty and comprehensive lockdown implemented 3 weeks into teaching for the semester. So the lockdown in New Zealand went on for a month, and then we slowly moved our way out of that lockdown experience to the point where we had no cases of COVID in New Zealand by the time we reached early May. New Zealand continued to kind of move to greater kind of freedoms, continued to have lockdown borders, but by June we were essentially functioning as normal. Teaching resumed in person. There were no mask mandates because there was no COVID in the community. That was our experience for quite a wee time. We had a summer, obviously summer here through the course of the end of the year, the holiday season. There were very small border insurgents of COVID, but there were essentially a free summer for people to operate through. If we just go to the next slide, thanks, Lisa. Then Delta came to New Zealand, which is why the title slide says mid-COVID. Our vaccinations here in New Zealand, and this is true of Australia as well, was relatively slow off the mark. So vaccinations didn't really commence in New Zealand until June of this year. So 9% of the population in June had their first dose, and by August it was only up to 25%. But then you'll see from the slide here, week 5 of our second semester this year, Delta was found in the New Zealand community, and New Zealand was moved into a lockdown within 24 hours of discovering that case. There has been a kind of challenging time since then because we've applied regional splits, and this is true of the Australian experience as well, where parts of New Zealand are locked down quite heavily, other parts are less locked down. What it has done though is galvanised people towards vaccination as the way out. So whilst we've got the suppression strategy, the approach for New Zealand is to vaccinate our way out of this and slowly lift restrictions based on vaccination rates. So 85% of the population now has had one dose, and so that difference between 31st of August and 18th of October is pretty phenomenal. And the same, it's a similar kind of number in Australia as well. Both countries taking this approach to start to slowly open up parts of how we operate based on vaccination rates. So next slide, Lisa. It's been really interesting hearing Danielle and Danja talk about the differences, because one of the things that I think did happen for New Zealand was actually quite a lot of collective approaches to how we managed COVID, a collective approach to why we did lockdowns, what we were doing to eliminate COVID. The team of 5 million was talked about a lot, and a lot of very clear guidance and communication from the government about what was expected under what circumstances, clear frameworks for operation, and also a lot of information specifically for the tertiary sector. So the Ministry of Education here in New Zealand were very clear about what various things were required of tertiary institutions, what you needed to have to open, what you needed to have to operate, and at the different levels of our alert system, what the plan was. It was all relatively guided and relatively collective in our approach. Next slide, please, Lisa. It's also interesting, I think, to listen to the impacts because they're not dissimilar. So international students is the 5th largest export earner for New Zealand. So it's a big deal here. The timing of the first lockdown and the border restrictions being placed meant that we have significantly reduced numbers of onshore international students, and Australia felt that incredibly acutely, and it's had a long tail when it comes to how the operation of tertiary institutions are funded and what kind of money they've got. And there's been large numbers of layoffs that have had to occur in the Australian sector in order to deal with the loss of income from international students. It's been disruptive for our students and their progression. Obviously, online learning doesn't work for everybody, but it's also something that's impacting our secondary school students. So how prepared our students are to come and enter into tertiary education is something that we're working through now, particularly now that we're going to have a second cohort of students who've had significant times away from their high school classrooms coming into the tertiary sector as well. So we're acutely aware of that impact on our operations and how we can make sure students are successful when they do come to the university. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. As mentioned by others, student hardship has been really challenging when you lock down everyone, when you close all your shops and you close everything but the supermarket and the doctors, your students' jobs dry up pretty quickly. And so there's been some coordination across the government, but also some institutions putting pretty significant amounts of money towards the hardship of students to try and continue to enable students to stay engaged and stay studying. Student mental health has been incredibly challenging over this time. In Australia, there's been a really significant number of lockdowns in some states. So in Victoria, there's been many weeks on end of lockdown, quite strict lockdowns, which has really eroded people's resilience. And that's true for staff as well, as mentioned by others. Again, as mentioned by others, campus life, the unmet expectations of what university was going to be. Our students last year managed to arrive, have a little bit of their orientation as this was emerging, and then went home again. And so their first year experience has been really different from what they expected to have. There's been anxiety about COVID amongst people, and that's something that we're dealing with particularly now with this different approach. New Zealand had gotten very used to not having COVID in the community, and so it being something we now need to work out how to live with, because that's suppression strategies clearly means COVID's going to be in the community, is a mind shift for a lot of people and quite challenging for many. And also just the idea of having a masked and distanced experience, again, not what people expected to be having to have it in the university experience. Vaccines and vaccine mandates and how we operate moving forward. If we just go to the next slide, I'll speak to that slightly because I submitted this presentation, I think about a week and a half ago. And then last week, the government announced a new pathway out of COVID, which included a new traffic light system. And inside that, they incorporated things like the requirement at a particular level for any students who's on campus to be vaccinated. So it would be a government mandate for vaccinations for students. Things that the government's announced things like a 90% vaccination rate before the country will start to open back up again. So the targets that are being aimed for are very high when it comes to vaccination, to the point where last 2 days ago, the government announced a change in employment law to enable employers to require vaccinations of staff. So this is where I kind of what I mean about the different approach in different countries as far as the collective and mandated and very clear approach that's come from the kind of New Zealand government. The plan pivot is what it feels like we've been doing for the last sort of 18 months. We make a plan and then we change, and then we make another plan and then we change. We've had a pandemic plan for our university, which has incorporated some of the specifics about how we operate over this time. And it over the course of the last 18 months, I think we're on to something like version 24, because we've had to tweak it up every time we either learn something or something changes about the environment. So that kind of agility has been really, really important to how we've responded, and also just the need for us to work inside our university as a team in a way we haven't had to before, I think has been really interesting as well. So thank you.
Amy, that's great. It's funny, you brought me back to the word pivot again, and we stopped using the word pivot at Memorial, where I work, Memorial University, because I actually felt like a basketball analogy. Pivot means you have one foot on the ground. And I thought in all of COVID, there was days I had no feet on the ground. And so we started using the word swivel. So I don't know, more COVID humor, I guess. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to pass it over to Pete now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pete Dicce. I am the Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Athletics at New York University, Abu Dhabi. But more importantly, for these purposes, I am the MENASA area, director for NASPA. So you can head to the next slide, Lisa. I'm just going to talk about just 5 general areas, and more philosophically on what sort of we're wrestling with here. Now, keep in mind that MENASA is a vast and highly diverse area. What's happening in Cairo is much different than Shanghai, and much different than Beirut, than Riyadh or Dubai, or Lahore. So distilling it all into one theme is just really, really challenging. But if we can go to the next slide. And I do like the Amy's pivot plan, because I've often said that our best ability is our flexibility or our adaptability during these last 18 months. But we need to be flexible in how we work. I don't think the sense around here is that we're not going to return to pre-pandemic work. We're going to have more flexibility on how we work, when we work, and where we work. And following up on Danielle's comment, we're in this period of this great resignation here and this burnout that's going on. And without having that flexibility and affording ourselves that flexibility, I think it's going to be challenging to keep good people in the profession without being burned out. In our personal lives, I think it's been a greater understanding of who we are going through sort of this trauma or this challenge, and then certainly giving us perspective on others also. And the other thing is, I know we have some of this nationalistic stuff going on lately, but I think this has proven that we are a truly globalized, interconnected, interdependent world. What's happening in various parts of the world is affecting all of us. And I think all the more reason that I think maybe some good will ultimately come out of this and pull us all much closer together. So we head to the next slide, Lisa, please. So connectivity was another area. Certainly, we're digitally connected at all times. We brought our work literally into our homes, through our cameras, and certainly into the homes of the students that we work with. So this integration of work and personal lives through digital connectivity, I think, is something that we're wrestling with. And what boundaries will we have, sort of in the future, knowing that we've opened this, and how do we pull back a little bit to get to the right sort of comfort level? from an interpersonal perspective, what we do is a hands-on, it's a tactile profession, but we're dealing with digital natives in this new generation here, and they expect to be interacted with digitally and in person, and some of them feel quite comfortable just working digitally. A lot of our colleagues said, this is the greatest thing that happened. This was fantastic. I've got to spend more time at home. But how do we go ahead and maintain that connection across generations, across people who there may be some inequalities along the way? How do we keep that connectivity? And then from an inter-university perspective, it's been amazing. I think we've Lisa and I, our institution, do some things together sports-wise, but we've really have been expanding, who the people we are connecting with. And so I think there's an opportunity there, and I think that will certainly continue into the future. Lisa, next year. Infrastructure, as one of the other speakers was talking about infrastructure, I think we're looking at, easily convertible, adjustable spaces, indoor, outdoor spaces can be quickly set up for different activities. And, I think we're really looking for how can we maximize spaces throughout our region that we can maybe not pivot, but maybe swivel quickly in order to go ahead and handle some of these challenges in the future. Obviously, internet accessibility is key, a broader and more reliable coverage. We've seen that with many of our students and their inability to access. So how do we provide that access? How can they come on or near campus to continue to get that access? And then I think from communication platforms, I think there's a definite move with COVID, which has accelerated my feeling on this digital nativity that's going on, and in providing curated content and customized interfaces for everybody to be dealing with. Next one. I think I think we're all dealing with stalled headcounts. We're all dealing with limited resources, budgeting. So I think data is going to be really important in the future. I think we're in the Moneyball era of higher education. Michael Lewis wrote the book Moneyball. You've probably seen the movie, maybe some of you, but I think we're looking to maximize as much as we can by interpreting meaningful data and mining it, and looking at various data points and coming up with formulas and models that will help predict some success. I think the data is going to be the evidence of when we go to ask for resourcing, we're going to need that. I think with things tightening up, we're going to need to go ahead and prove what the outcomes are based upon the evidence that we're pulling together. And then lastly, I think we're moving into the age of predictive analytics. I think that's the way where we can maximize, the greatest bang for the buck, so to speak, by predicting student success, student engagement, and predicting outcomes along the way. I'm sure there's universities well ahead of many of us, and I'm sure there's universities well behind us, but I think this is an area where we can really start sharing, especially in this region where some universities are really resource rich and others are really, living on the edge or existing on the edge based upon their, the resources that they do have. And then the last slide. These are more questions that I have. Who are we? Post-COVID, what are our values post-COVID? When we look at our institutions, how did our institutions react to, COVID? How did they interact with the students? How did they help provide and help sort this journey for our students? And do our values align with our institutional values? Where some of us may be saying, hey, that didn't work out, or listen, I'm really aligned more than ever. And I think this is a period of reassessment. I think Danielle was talking about that reassessment. That really resonated with me. And then I think, once again, I go back to this globalized, interconnected, and interdependent world. And how do our values integrate with that? How do we provide value and real meaningful impact beyond our students, beyond our geographical locations, knowing that, what we're doing may ripple, along the way. So in the last slide, I think you'll have some institutions and some individuals that are going to strive and try to strive the best they can. I think others are going to thrive. They're going to absolutely thrive. And I think it's really based upon their willingness to innovate and work within the gray, embrace change. Or as I say, from an athletic standpoint, during these last 18 months, the ball went off the field. We ran and got it, and we threw it back on the field, and we just tried to continue to play. And, and is there a willingness to do that? When in doubt, I think you do what Coach Lasso does. You slap the sign and you just believe. And I think if we can collectively believe, I think we can certainly get there. So hopefully I was within my time, Lisa. I didn't get another message. So thanks.
You were perfect. Perfect. Pete, that was great. And thanks for reminding us too about the values piece. I think that's going to be a very interesting piece coming out of all of this, is what are our values, and have our values flexible? Have they changed? What do we consider important moving forward? I think one thing to talk about. I'm going to pass it off now to Sibusiso. I think you're online, are you? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. I was worried. Hello, everybody. My name is Sibusiso Chalufu, and I work as the Executive Director of Student Life, which is Student Affairs here at the Northwest University in South Africa. But I also serve as the President of our association, which is the South African Association of Senior Student Affairs Professionals, which deals with all our student affairs and services professionals. It's indeed a great honor and a privilege to be part of this important global engagement. And on behalf of my colleagues in student affairs and services, I really, particularly in SAASSAP, I want to extend a great gratitude for the invitation that was extended to us by IASAS and ACPA. I do want to start off by giving a disclaimer. Although SAASSAP represents all student affairs and services professionals in the southern tip of Africa, specifically in South Africa, I don't claim nor do I want to pretend to be speaking on behalf of all of our vast and quite diverse continent. So I just want to make that clear. I'm representing South Africa, which is just one small part of the continent. There's three issues that I want to briefly touch on. One, it's what has been the state of play in our environment. Two, I want to touch on the issue of mental health and wellness, because it's a big issue for us in our country, in higher education. And then I want to talk about the issue of vaccination mandates and the new normal. Other colleagues have also alluded to that, but it is a big thing for us at this moment. So in South Africa, we've had a lockdown since March 2020. And at some point, there were a variety of them, from the hardest, which was level 4 or 5, to the softest, level 1 and 2. We are currently on level 1. But at the height of the pandemic, when we were at level 5 in March 2020, everything came to a standstill. And I want to argue that higher education or our universities were one of the hardest hit. In terms of what happened at our institutions, as we all know, student affairs and services activities are predominantly require physical presence, and they depend a lot on contact mode of presentation in terms of our programs. These were adversely affected by COVID-19 outbreak. COVID-19 actually, for us as a country, it exposed the technological divide. I think the last speaker was touching on that, but for us it was quite huge. It gave us a sense that there is indeed this schism that exists insofar as technology is concerned. It also made evident the urgent need for us, not only just students, but also for us as staff, to actually attend to our technological competencies and the skills that are required for us to operate in the new normal. This resulted in some institutions having to undergo a very steep learning curve, which demanded that we had to migrate our student life experiences from a predominantly contact mode to an integrated and an agile hybrid mode in terms of service delivery. It required us to actually create opportunities for a positive and enriching student experience, because that's what, students come to university to get qualifications, but that student experience is what also gets them to want to come to university. Though not to the same extent, a number of our colleagues actually at our various institutions managed to host webinars. They managed to provide psychosocial support services to our students, and they also managed to ensure that there was still student engagement in terms of student governance, and also in terms of arts and culture activities, which were hosted virtually. But once the lockdown restrictions were eased, as is the case now, a number of universities were able to host, still in a hybrid mode, a number of co-curricular activities and events, so as to create some semblance of normality in our institutions. As one of the colleagues who's a dean in one of the universities commented, COVID-19 allowed us to be creative, to be innovative, especially when we had to transition from manual to digital platforms in terms of the work that we do in student affairs and services. With respect to online programs, there's an annual survey that was conducted by StuDoc regarding the World University Rankings in 2021. Which asked students whether their university had offered them sufficient facilities to follow classes online, and whether the lecturers or the professors were easily accessible and easily contactable. 24 universities out of the 26 universities that we have in the country were ranked, and only 2 of the universities were actually ranked high in terms of remote learning. And one of those was luckily my university, the Northwest University. Of course, there are a number of challenges, and regarding the remote learning ratings, which compared quite favorably to and in line with European and American universities. So if you look at how our universities have been able to to provide this online learning, they've done well. But according to a report that was done by the University of Cape Town, while the virtual classes on tablets and on laptops have become a global norm, many South African students actually lack access to the internet. So issues around data, issues around connectivity become a challenge. And again, that technological divide comes into the picture. The second and last thing that I want to quickly speak about is the issue around mental health and wellness of our students. So a few months ago, in August, one of our national newspapers ran a story around youth suffering severe psychological distress during the pandemic. This was based on the Human Sciences Research Council research, which had indicated that the COVID-19 pandemic actually hit young people very hard, more particularly the first year university students, who found it quite difficult to cope. These students, according to the survey, suffered from severe psychological distress, from isolation, from stress, and from an inability to cope with the workload. And of course, they had nobody to engage with except online. our institutions have been forced to rethink and redesign their psychosocial support to our students, despite already doing quite a lot under very challenging circumstances. One of the critical issues that has been raised in our context is that not only in the higher education sector, is that as we are busy tackling and dealing with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we should not lose sight or actually even drop the ball in respect of other pandemics, such as gender-based violence, which is quite endemic in our context, the issues around HIV and AIDS, and issues around substance abuse. The last point the last aspect that I want to talk about is around the vaccination mandates and the new normal. One of the most contentious issues that is currently in our universities is the issue of mandatory vaccination. In respect of us, of course, trying to return to some kind of normalcy. And I've heard what other speakers, including the speaker from Germany, have said regarding the issue of vaccination. A number of higher education institutions, universities, have served as vaccination sites and as satellite sites. However, despite that, we still have a very low numbers of our students who are coming up to vaccinate. 2 of our universities have decided on mandatory vaccination. In other words, for the next year, next semester in 2022, according to these universities, if you want to come to campus, you must be vaccinated. And you can imagine that of 26 universities, only 2. And to me, it says that we are not, as a sector, taking a sectoral approach and trying to move in that way. Our student leaders are totally against the issue of mandatory vaccination. They have actually emphasized the importance of advocacy campaigns and in order to deal with the myths, to deal with the misinformation, the disinformation, and the issue of fake news. They want students to be encouraged, not to be forced to vaccinate. We are looking at the issue of how we as a country can tackle the mandatory vaccination, or at least the regulation. And as SAASSAP, we have organized a webinar which will be taking place on the 3rd of November to look at the social compact and the vaccination mandate, because we think this is an issue that is critical for us to tackle before we start the new academic year. We understand that there's complexity around this issue, but we think that there's a need for a sectoral approach. We believe that one of the best ways for us to revert back to some kind of normalcy is to have a huge number of students being vaccinated. But how we get around that is an issue that we are busy dealing with. We do have other challenges, which if I had time, I would have wanted to speak about student funding and others. But for now, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So Sibusiso, there was one. Thank you very much for sharing some of your experiences. I'm always intrigued that our experiences are very similar in so many different ways, and then yet different in other ways. So that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to pass it off to Joe now. Joe.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Everyone hear me, right?
Yep. It's great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm Joseph. Okay. From Hong Kong. I'm currently the chairperson of Hong Kong Student Services Association, connecting 22 tertiary institutions in Hong Kong. And I'm also the head of student affairs of the Hong Kong Polytechnic Universities. Okay, so I'm happy to share some of the findings, okay, in Hong Kong among my colleagues. And okay, let me start with some background. Okay, actually, each university in Hong Kong has its policy to arranging the provision of student services during and after the pandemic. And most university has changed to a hybrid mode of teaching in this September. Okay, and particularly, okay, the online mode will be to be conducted for those non-local students, okay, which is very essential for them. And in the following, I will share some of the experience, okay, from many of our institutes in Hong Kong. So it is a very short presentation. Okay, hope we can concentrate on the scenario in Hong Kong here. Okay, so first of all, on the career service or counseling, okay, actually, in the job market, okay, we focus more on the job hunting skill previously, but now, okay, we would promote some digital skill, okay, which is required from many employers. Okay, they would like to have more online communication skills and digital skills. And we will also conduct some online interview, okay, it's requested by the most of the employers. And so students need some decent place for the interview, but may not all of them have this decent background. Okay, so we would some institutions just like us to provide some stations or some rooms for their interview within the campus. So it is one thing to help our students. For some career fairs, okay, the number of participating companies is about the same, but the mode is moved online. Okay, so the interaction undoubtedly not as good as previous. Okay, but it is another way we can conduct this kind of fairs. And about the personal counseling, we have some individual counseling sections. Okay, it will be kept on, and we also have some counseling section over the phone or even some virtual sections. Okay, just like using the WhatsApp or this kind of social media. And for the face-to-face communication, okay, we will have some precautionary actions, just like hand rubs, face shields, or disposable gloves, okay, to be provided for the counselors and also for the students, okay. And undoubtedly, it is some sort of distancing, okay, may not be so ideal, but it is actually being conducted. So it is the case. And let me, for the counseling session, okay, we will have some workshops also conducted. So about the support to our students and the developmental activities, okay, we have moved most of the developmental or thematic workshop over the web, okay, which is conducted over Zoom or Teams. We have the common observation that the enrollment number is quite good, but the interaction is less. And one advantage of doing online is that, okay, many guest speakers can come to be invited, okay, for both local guest speaker and even overseas speaker. So our orientation we was keeping on, but many of them are changed online. Okay, so it is quite challenging for many students because for the newcomers, okay, for the last year, okay, during the last year in the secondary school, they already encountered the life that without very many face-to-face teaching. Okay, but in the hybrid mode, it is another challenging way of learning in universities. So another thing is about the financial support. Okay, some institutions will provide some financial support for the student to purchase some computing equipment. Okay, and also about the student participation. Okay, it is fine. Okay, in terms of the online enrollment, but as mentioned, okay, many students quite reluctant to do more in interaction. Particularly, they would not like to turn on the camera. Okay, so that is the case. And also about the external liaison. Okay, many entrance to the campus will need some health declarations for the visitors, and some institution will provide some SIM card. Okay, so that the academics and professional staff can also link with the student by using those social media, just like WhatsApp, and also some government funds are provided to enhance the physical wellness, and so that they would students are encouraged to do some fitness exercise at home. So next is about the interaction with the international students. Okay, on the next slide. Thank you. So undoubtedly, much less, okay, new students, okay, coming to the campus, okay, from the foreign countries, and there are no outbound experience from local students, but many institutions also arrange some virtual exchange. Okay, it is something that we can do with. Okay, the vaccination requirements is imposed for all the hostel, so that all the students have to do so. So it is basically the same as previous speaker has mentioned. Okay, we comes to the last slide about the student organizations. And actually the activities in general are adopted also online or in hybrid mode. And some offline activity is not encouraged. Okay, some orientation activities provided by the students can be rolled out, but not so interested by the student. And some virtual organization fairs also help. And for the election, okay, it's also carried out, okay, but with some information technology support will be required. So that is my presentation. Okay, thanks very much for your listening. Okay, thank you. Let's go back to Rob. Yeah.
Joseph, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think that there's what we're going to do, we only have a few minutes left. So what we're going to do is put the questions in the chat room. And if we can't get to all of the minutes, what we're going to do, Lisa and I will facilitate the questions, and we'll get some answers for you, and then email out to all the delegates that are participating. I think that will, at least you'll get your question answered, even if we run out of a bit of time. But anyways, let's go into Jackie, Dr. Huggins' question, and it is, for any speaker, what was the interaction between senior management and student services staff in terms of recognizing their importance to the operation of university performance and consultation before decisions were made? If it was a positive, is this something that you believe will continue post-COVID? So that's for any speaker.
All right, since no one's jumping in, I'll jump in on this. Yeah, you know, I think there were some positives. You know, I think that it really, for many, I think it depended on where you were on the front line of that interface, and how effective your leadership within student affairs were able to disseminate that information and sort of set forth what needed to be done and all. And then I think what was good, at least at our location, is it was a constant two-way feedback loop that would go back and forth, so that with the sort of our frontline workers who are really putting in a tremendous amount of hours, and we brought all our students back from all over the world onto campus so that they would have the digital connectivity and all. Is trying to get their feedback and then relaying that back up to upper administration. But I think at the end of the day, I think upper administration, senior administration realized that we were critical to the students' happiness, well-being, and whether they were going to be able to thrive. And without us, they just couldn't do it.
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that as well. We actually found that we worked with an agility and pace that included all of that kind of focus on the well-being of students in a way that we wouldn't do normally. And one of the challenges has been to try and continue that on in our normal, in other normal parts of our operation, which has been super interesting. So the pulling together of different groups of people occurred in order to respond, and how do we make that a bit more of a business as usual practice, as opposed to go back to the old kind of hierarchical sort of way of doing things, or slower way of doing things. There's been a cry out for that, and that's something we're trying to work through at the moment.
Sibusiso?
Let me share some ideas. Okay, so I think most of the university would care about the mental health of the student and their well-being. Okay, it is their main concern in terms of students' whole personal development. Sometimes, okay, they will think about how to make use of the technology to do so. Okay, just like how we can make use of the Zoom platform or the Microsoft Teams platform to do so. They would think of some approach that the distancing is very important because the safety is the first concern. Okay, so it's the act of balancing, okay, of the risk factor and the students' well-being in terms of communication and interactivity with the faculty members as well as those professional counselors. That's our case, yeah.
Absolutely. Sibusiso, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to say that just like the first speaker, for a while, student affairs and services have been marginalized and we were seen as being in the periphery. But with COVID-19, it became clear that we have quite a critical role to play. So, for example, with our COVID-19 response task team, when it was first formed, student affairs and services was nowhere to be found, and also students were not even represented. But I tell you, now going forward, every decision, every aspect, student affairs is brought on board, and the role of student has been quite highlighted. So there are some positives in this. And to the latter part of the question, do we think that things will continue in that positive trajectory? I personally think so, because we've now all realized that we are not just people who keep students busy when they are not in lectures. We have a critical role to play in terms of their growth and development. Thank you.
That's wonderful. We have about 1 more minute. Any burning responses? If not, what we can do is I can just wrap up and say thank you to all the panelists for taking the time, sharing your experiences with us. I think there's some form of professional development that comes from even putting it on a PowerPoint and sharing it, that when we reflect back over the last 18, 19 months, how our worlds have changed. I think as we navigate the post-COVID, IASAS will be in a leadership role to bring you all together from time to time under webinars and all our functions and structures. Because I think one of the things that one of the panelists said is that we've all learned that we're very interconnected. And in this whole process, what happens in one part of the world also impacts the rest of us. So I think that by mutual sharing, we can move forward and be very different. And I want to say thank you to all the people who signed on to the call today. You have very, very busy lives, but it's been great to see some of the names pop up. It's been great to see some of your faces. And I look forward to, once again, at some point in time, back in the saddle and back face to face at some point to see you all. But thank you very much. And as always, if there's anything you need from IASAS or any new ideas or things, please reach out to myself or Lisa or Brigitte or any one of us. And I think the only way we're going to grow this organization is with you and your support. So thank you all for this. Have a great rest of the day or a morning or evening, whatever we're doing. Have a great one. Bye-bye.